All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's CAEP Data Dive Part 3 webinar hosted by Jay Wright from CASAS. My name is Liberty Van Atten, and I'm the project specialist for the California Adult Education Program Technical Assistance Project. Before we begin today, I'm going to go over some general housekeeping. So during the webinar, if you have general questions, please go ahead and post them in the general chat box at the right of the screen. Jay or those of us who are on will answer these questions at our first opportunity. If you need technical assistance, please put a note in the chat box. Veronica just put in there, please let me know if you can't hear me at this time, and I guess you can't hear me say that, but this is a great way to say that. If you have logged in using your credentials, your consortium name, a school site, or an acronym, could you please identify who you are in the chat pod? And if you have others with you who are participating in the webinar, please let us know how many people you have with you, because it helps us get a more accurate count of attendees for today. And just as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. The recording and the presentation slides will be available for download on the California Adult Education Program website. And as always, if there is a need for technical assistance, please contact TAP. Thank you. Let's get started, Jay.
Okay, hopefully everybody can hear me too. I guess I'll wait and see a few people confirm here. Hopefully, it looks like, yep, great, thank you for that. Okay, so you can see the cover slide on your screen. And sorry, you know, a lot of you are familiar names, so you know I'm a little bit annoying in asking these silly questions. So my survey question here is, how many of you did this training? I believe we offered it on Wednesday, February the 20th. That is, we did the quote-unquote qualitative data dive where we looked at some TE reports, but instead of getting into things like drill down in Excel like we looked at in late March, we're kind of looking at the reports and then giving you some qualitative suggestions on what sort of things you might do based on what your data tells you. Just curious how many are coming back in again. I see a lot of yeses. Okay, looks like it's a mixed bag, but overall lots of people did. Great. You know, not important that you did, just kind of seeing what we've got ourselves into here today. So I just kind of described what the training is about. Here's a little bit of agenda. So while we're not going to go crazy on AEP reporting, that was a little bit more for the quantitative workshops we did a couple weeks ago on March 25th and March 27th. As an aside, we've got several face-to-face workshops scheduled where we'll be doing that as well, but we will start by looking at the basics on AEP reporting, because that's the framework from which we need to derive all the suggestions. So we're basically taking a basic look at reports to identify the concept of performance and persistence. So you can see I probably should have used NRS once but not both times, but there's a concept called performance and persistence as it relates to federal NRS reporting that yahoos like me have been talking about for quite a while. So the idea with this workshop is, number one, just reiterate those concepts that we've been talking about for a while from an NRS point of view. That's kind of the way we necessarily need to get our foot on the rail, so to speak. And then what we're taking as a second step is applying those NRS concepts that we've been tossing over for a while and trying to apply them to an AEP perspective rather than an NRS perspective, you know, kind of providing the parallels between NRS Table 4 and the Persister Report, and then comparing that to things like the AEP Summary so we can apply these same concepts to AEP. So whether we're using NRS reports, AEP reports, or both, we're basically identifying performance at an agency and or a consortium level. We're identifying persistence in the same ways, and then of course there's different ways we can decide where we are. You know, we can have performance that's high, performance that's low, and of course we can have persistence that's high and persistence that's low. And so once we determine those two basic questions, we can then you know, figure out what the appropriate strategies might be for an improvement. We're looking at agency level strategies and student level strategies based on those 4 possible ways that we can view performance and persistence. That probably sounds a little confusing right now, but I'll get more into it. Hopefully it'll be less confusing as we move along. Once we identify all those strategies, we'll also look at some resources, some things available from TAP, some things available from here at CASAS that hopefully will be other ways that you can get assistance and moving forward on improving both performance and persistence. So another annoying question, I guess I'll just make sure, does that all, number one, sound okay? And number 2, more to the point, sound more or less like what you were expecting to get yourselves into here this afternoon? Yes and yes. All right, wonderful. Okay, everybody's thinking they're in the right place. Okay, so here's one that everybody knows already. This is just a review of AEP reports and TE. Again, under the state reports menu, we have all these wonderful reports. I think we're all good to go there. We also have the AEP Summary. This is where we'll be spending, the bulk of the AEP analysis from. Again, we've got that report in that menu I just showed you. Again, the 3 different levels of reporting. I'm sure, with this group, I think you've all heard high bar to the left, medium bar in the middle, low bar to the right several times. Nothing new under the sun for the overwhelming majority of you here. But again, left-hand side is literacy gains, so it basically includes all the requirements from Table 4. The middle section requires most of what the feds require, but the difference is literacy gains requires information about pre- and post-testing because it covers pre- and post-testing. The middle section includes issues with demographics, 12 hours, program and class enrollment, but does not require anything related to testing. And then the right-hand side for services really doesn't require anything other than a valid ID and a correctly recorded service. As long as you provide that minimum information, you'll get there. But just again, that's, kind of the hub of the AEP reporting universe and TE, you might say. Moving along here, we also have the DIR, another way to kind of verify your agency performance, potentially a way to follow up on persistence. So again, the AEP Summary and AEP Integrity just brought forward to assist you in making that initial determination. Obviously, in order to follow suggestions for how to, improve agency performance and persistence, you need to have that accurate measuring stick. So we're suggesting the AEP Summary is one good way to use the measuring stick. If you don't like the AEP Summary, you might say an alternative might be to use the AEP Data Integrity, although the examples that we're going to be using in this webinar will focus more on the AEP Summary. But just to reiterate, we've got the 27 items on the Data Integrity covering all sorts of different areas of AEP performance. And again, we're looking at, doing that, getting that percentage by taking the item count of each individual item and basically measuring that up against that bottom line number we get at the top of enrollment across the 7 AEP programs. Okay, so I'll pause. I think that's all review for this crowd. Eyeballing you, most of you look like you've been around for a lot of these workshops, so I think we've got a pretty savvy group here. But just to make sure everybody good to go on these AEP reports, I went through it quickly on purpose, feeling like this is all stuff everybody knows already. Is that a good assumption or a foolish one? Okay, if it was a foolish one, would you all be right up front and tell me, yeah, what a foolish assumption that was, Jay. You need to get yourself going a little bit more smartly than you are right now. You'd absolutely whack me in the head if you had to, right? Okay, everybody, that's the easiest question you'll get all day. Okay, so let's move into the NRS side, because I really think to get everybody's foot on the rail, you really need to know the NRS concept first in order to apply the AEP concept correctly. So as you might imagine, the hub of the NRS universe is Table 4. That is the the NRS reporting table that focuses on educational gains. That is the NRS reporting table that's about pre and post testing. So a quick review here, we've got the 12 levels, 6 for ABE, 6 for ESL. We look at that qualifying pre-test. That basically gets you on this table. That's what's counted in column B, where we show number of participants. That is based on whether it's an ABE or ESL student and their specific pre-test score. That pre-test score is what fits the student into one of these 12 federal educational functioning levels. So based on qualifying pre-test, they'll fit into one of these 6 ABE levels or 6 ESL levels. Once you complete that pre-test and post-test based on gain, they'll fit in column D here. That is total number of, the column E, sorry, giving you the wrong letter here, but column E will basically show you the number who made at least one functioning level gain. So you get on the map, so to speak, by that qualifying pre-test. You get recorded as successfully making that level gain by making enough gain from pre-test to post-test to place into the next highest level on that federal chart. As most of you know, sometimes it's a 1 or 2 point gain, sometimes it requires more of a 10 or 12 point gain, but bottom line is, through federal reporting, the feds would say it evens out in the wash. You have that way of looking at everybody who makes that gain for pre and post testing. So you're looking at that percentage that you can see on column I on this screenshot. That's simply column E divided by column B. That is the percentage of students at each level that make a gain. In California and in all other states, we set a certain trend where, over the last several years, there is kind of a pattern we've set where the pattern is not the same for all 12 levels, but if you look at each of these 12 levels individually and look across the last 5 or 10 years, for the most part, for all 12 levels, we have enough state level data now for, 10, 15, almost 20 years now, where a pattern has emerged for each level, where there is a state goal we set each year and a statewide average we get each year. For the most part, that goal and average doesn't stay exactly the same, but we're pretty darn consistent if you look at it aggregately across 5 or 10 years. We'll get into it in resources, but the bottom line is if you look at the CASAS data portal, you can also look at our statewide aggregated performance over the last several years. That's where I would suggest you can kind of figure out what the statewide goal or quote-unquote average is. So when you look at your own agency level of performance, you can figure out quickly and easily whether you're above average, below average, doing really well, doing really poorly, or something in between. Okay, so that's enough on table 4. Another quick sanity check. Everybody following all this, is this all mostly review? I think it is, but want to be sure. Okay, everybody who's answering me is saying yes, so I'll take that as a good sign. Just fire up with questions if I'm going off on too much of a tangent. So again, table 4 is where you're determining your agency level performance and also comparing it on the state level of performance as well. So we also have table 4B. The purpose of 4B is essentially the same purpose as table 4, but the difference is table 4 is looking at all students who qualify for federal reporting. Table 4B is only looking at those who have a pre-post pair. So when we look at things like state goals, bottom line is table 4 is the one that really quote-unquote matters, because the Fed set goals based on all WIOA enrollees, not just those with the pre-post pair. But you might say a lot of individuals, a lot of agencies or states might say the better, fairer way of doing it is only looking at those that have a pre-post pair. If you don't have a pair, obviously you have a 0% chance of making a gain, so you need to look at 4B and confine your view to just those with the pair in order to get a fairer, more accurate view. So bottom line is, when we're looking at whether we do or do not pass federal muster, like it or not, we must use table 4, not 4B, but 4B gives you another way of looking at performance and whether we're looking strong or not so much. And then finally, we have the NRS Persister. This is another report under the TE Federal Reports menu, but the Persister simply looks at 4 and 4B and compares the two. That is, it will take the number at each level who qualify on Table 4B and divide that by the number at each level who qualify for Table 4, and that will yield that percentage of persister for each of those 12 federal levels. You can see that on column D in this screenshot. That's simply showing you of those at each level of those who qualify for NRS Table 4, how many also qualify for NRS Table 4B. Cutting to the chase, what that percentage of persister gives you is at each level how many students successfully stuck around long enough or persisted long enough in order to complete a pre-test and a post-test. That's the way NRS looks at that concept of persistence. That is, how many stick around long enough to have a pre-test and a post-test. Like I mentioned for performance, there's also some 10 or 15 some odd years of state-level performance for persistence. So you can look at that CASAS data portal to get a pretty obvious trend for persistence, just like you can garner that trend for performance. Making a very long story short, for 5, 6, 7 years at least, our statewide persistence rate has been about 70%. Sometimes it's 71, sometimes it's 72, sometimes it's 69. It bumps up and down, but bottom line is it boils down to being at about 70% for the last, several years. So we look at the Persister report to get that NRS concept of persistence. So once again, I'm going to do another, so looking at persistence here, you can see column C, the number who show up on 4B divided by column B, that is the number who show up on NRS Table 4, equals that percentage of persister on column D, that is the percentage, that is that persistence rate for each of those 12 federal levels. Okay, so I'm going to take another sanity break here. Are we all good on the NRS way of measuring performance as well as the NRS way of measuring persistence? This is just to get the ground level, view of how we're doing all this. Okay, everybody's saying yes. So now what we're going to do is make that transition out of NRS and into AEP then, where again we have these NRS definitions we've been talking about for quite a while. So now we're trying to apply those same basic concepts to our AEP reports. So we're looking at, number one, looking at the literacy gains. So that would be the way we make a direct apples-to-apples comparison. We have our way of looking at pre-post results on the federal tables. If we just look at that left-hand section of the AEP Summary, that basically provides the same sort of AEP data that Table 4 and 4B do for NRS. So that's the most obvious comparison, where we can look at NRS style methods of measuring performance and persistence with that left-hand section. That'll use that same NRS approach of persistence, which is looking at it in terms of pre-post results. So then we're also looking at these questions that we've been reviewing at the state level, where the state has kind of looked at more AEP-like ways of looking at quote-unquote persistence. These next 3 bullets, you might say, look at it in 3 different ways. So looking at the low bar way of looking at it, you could say of everybody that has any activity, any AEP activity whatsoever, that is, they just get on the radar screen in any of those 3 sections of the AEP Summary, how many stick around long enough to get at least 1 hour of instruction and enroll in a class that fits into one of those 7 officially authorized AEP programs. That's a low bar way of measuring persistence. Looking at the 3rd bullet, taking it to the next level, of those who stick around and get at least 1 hour of instruction and enroll in one of those 7 AEP programs, how many get at least 12 hours of instruction and thereby qualify for official AEP reporting, and oh, by the way, also qualify for NRS reporting? That's another way of looking at it. And then the bottom bullet is taking it to the next level, that is, of those who stick around long enough and get at least 12 hours of instruction, how many of those who get 12 hours of instruction actually earn one or more official AEP outcomes. So you might say these are 3 slightly easier, slightly lower bar methods of looking at that concept of persistence. I'll kind of double back to that top bullet, where the other way, of course, using AEP reporting is of those who stick around long enough to qualify for that literacy gain section. That is, they have 12 hours demographics and also have that qualifying pretest. How many of those students actually stick around long enough to also get that matching post-test? That would be the more direct way to match persistence from an NRS point of view. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, count them, 4 different ways of measuring persistence. You might say this is a you say tomato, I say tomato issue, to use one of my favorite cliches, that you have 4 different ways of kind of deciding which way you want to measure your own agencies and or your own consortium's level of persistence. Again, you can use one of those ways. Ideally, you're kind of looking at all 4 of those ways to kind of make sure, you know, you're getting apples to apples and on firm ground with all ways of measuring, to get a definitive way to be able to, at the end of the day, be able to say, is your agency at a high or low level of persistence? Is your consortium at a high or low level of persistence? By backtracking, you can also do all these methods to be able to say, is your agency at a high or low level of performance? Is your consortium at a high or low level of performance? Okay, so before I get into these details, I'm going to do another sanity check on you. Does it make sense to you now, looking at it from an NRS or AEP point of view, on how you can definitively determine high-low performance, high-low persistence? Any questions there? Everybody's saying you're right there with me. So that's your story and you're sticking to it, I suppose. We're going to take your word for it here. It's almost eerie that there aren't any questions. I'm starting to get a little bit nervous. But on that note, we're going to move forward anyway. So measuring AEP persistence, we're starting with the apples-to-apples comparison to NRS, where we're looking at the literacy gain sections and looking at pre- and post-testing. That is, here's how you can use your AEP reports to measure persistence using more or less the exact same concept as how they measure persistence from an NRS point of view. So again, we're looking at that left-hand literacy gain section. We're just using a snapshot to keep it kind of simpler and easier here, where we're looking at the 4 different AEP programs where you're required to do pre- and post-testing, and we're looking at those 3 columns under literacy gains, where we've got the number of enrollees in column B, we have the number who had a pre-post pair, and we had another who actually made a gain in column D. So we have these 3 columns where we can figure out persistence and performance pretty easily. So if you look at the first hand, again, enrollees in column B requires demographics, requires class and program enrollment, requires 12 hours, and also requires that qualifying pretest. So if you just compare that column C, the number that have a pre-post pair, and divide it up against column B, that will give you your persistence rate by AEP program, that is, of those who qualify for NRS Table 4, for those who have all those minimum qualifications, how many stuck around long enough or persisted long enough to get a pre-post pair. If you just take column C divided by column B, that can give you that persistence rate against each, of those AEP programs. And as I said, just to cut to the chase, if you look, there is no baseline for AEP. We don't have enough data to really do that. But if you just look up against that, from an NRS point of view, our persistence rate for the last 5, 6, 7 years has been about 70%. So that's not perfect, but that's a good ballpark figure if you want a basic number to know here's, good persistence versus not so good persistence. If you're more, okay, what I'll say is I don't have a slide for this. I should have added it. But if you're more interested in AEP performance, again, I kind of showed you how you can do that using Table 4. If you'd prefer to use it using an AEP report, then I would say simply look at column D divided by column B. That basically shows of everybody who qualifies for AEP, for everybody who qualifies for NRS Table 4, how many actually made that level gain. That would be a direct apples to apples comparison of looking at those who made a level gain on Table 4, column D. The percentage won't be the same because it's by program, not by level, but that's another good way to kind of determine AEP performance. What I'll just say is there's no real exact way to give you a rule of thumb. For that, you really kind of need to look at each individual level for a baseline point of view, but I'll just say overall, you know, our AEB ASE data is lower than our ESL. I'd say ABE ASE is probably around 45% if you look at those 6 levels overall. ESL is probably more like 60 to 65% if you look at those 6 levels overall. I'm very vague on the baseline for performance because I've got to say for performance, we really have a wide range based on that specific level from NRS point of view. So you really kind of need to look at it by level. There's not as good of a uniform answer for performance like I've been giving you here for persistence. Yes, D divided by B is performance. I don't know about the timing of your question. I'll assume, Jody, that you stole my thunder there and I'm just not paying attention to chat. So yes, you're correct. By quarter, not really by quarter, but you can look at performance by past program years, certainly. You know, I'm not sure why you would need it by quarter, but again, you can look for as many years as you have in TE, you can do that Persister report in the federal reports menu. Yes, you can certainly look at previous program years. I'll get more into it once we get into resources, but I would say overall, the best way to look at previous years is probably looking at the CASAS data portal rather than getting into TE, but we'll get into that here, last 5 minutes or so of this when we get into resources. Okay, so moving along here, looking at the other ways of measuring. So we're looking at the straight apples to apples with NRS performance and persistence, and then looking at pre and post testing on the AEP report. Here's the first of those 3 questions that have been asked at the statewide level. The first one is, how many adult ed program students that participate, how many stick around long enough or persist, there's that word again, how many persist long enough to at least enroll in one of those 7 AEP programs. Again, that's just getting 1 hour of instruction, but it's still a form of persistence because you know you get a lot of those fly-by-nighters that just come in and kick the tires, come in for a cup of coffee, whatever goofy cliche you like, but a lot of people come in to kick the tires and then never show up again. So one way to measure persistence is, of those that just come in to kick the tires or stop for a cup of coffee, how many do you capture enough to at least get enrolled in one of your classes and thereby at least get 1 hour of instruction? So this is what we talked about in that quantitative session where we're looking at column L. So we're moving over to the right-hand section here where we're looking at the total unduplicated count, which is the bottom number. So if you can see, hopefully you can see that 3240. And then what we need to do is weed out that 1107. That is, we're looking at that unduplicated number. That is the total number that just have some activities, period. And then we're weeding out those that have no designated program. The no designated program represents the total that did stop in for a cup of coffee but then did not stick around long enough to get that 1 hour of instruction. So moving it to the next slide, we're taking this 3240, subtracting that 1107, so that gets us that 21, 32 or whatever, and then so we divide that number by the 3240, that gets about 65-66%. So that is, of those that have any activity in AEP, we're determining that about 65% of our learners in this example stuck around long enough to enroll in an AEP program and get at least 1 hour of instruction. So to be clear, this is just showing how we can make that calculation from our AEP report. Okay, those would probably be in that 1107 that never get into a program. If the question, I guess the answer is the way you're talking about it is that sounds like students that never really get any actual program enrollment. So you're looking at trying to get those students, if they're just randomly doing short-term services, what you're trying to do is get them to stick around and actually enroll in ABE, ESL, CTE. So if that's all they're doing, then they're not really in an official AEP program. So the idea here is to get some of those students to stick around and be enamored enough in your adult school that they actually get hours of instruction. If all they're doing with short-term services, then technically that means by definition they have 0 hours of instruction. The hours of instruction are from those 7 official AEP programs. From the way you're describing it, that's just services that are not part of those official AEP programs. So you're trying to get them to actually enroll in these programs. So the second one is, once you get those who do enroll in an AEP program, how many stick around to get at least 12 hours? So here we're comparing column E to column L. So you can see we've got this 1408 in column E, and we're equating that to the 3240. To get the, apples to apples consistent number, we're going to take that total unduplicated in column E, and we're going to divide it up against that number in column L that we get after we subtract that 1107. So again, we're taking of those who get 12 hours of instruction, so of those who get at least 1 hour of instruction, that is the number we get after we weed out those that have 0, how many are actually sticking around to get 12 hours of instruction? So we take that 2132 number, and take the 1408 and divide it by that 2132. That gets us at about 66%. So again, we're taking those that have 0 hours, weeding it down to those that get at least 1 hour in an official AEP program. Now we're taking it the next step. Of those who get in an official AEP program, how many are getting that 12 hours of instruction? Here we're getting a similar percent, but we're of course using completely different numbers. Okay, and then finally, the last of these 3 metrics, we start with the universe of everybody. We figure out of the universe of everybody how many get at least 1 hour of instruction or qualify for one of those 7 AEP programs. Of those that do that with official program enrollment in 1 hour of instruction, how many get at least 12 hours of instruction? So now we're taking it to that last step of those that get at least 12 hours of instruction. How many achieve at least one AEP outcome? So now we're looking at that middle section, and we're just looking at columns F, G, H, I, J, and K. That is the 6 areas of AB 104. We're adding all 6 of those AP, reporting areas together, getting a sum, and then dividing it against those that qualify for those outcomes with at least 12 hours of instruction. That gives us what we're calling the outcomes attainment rate. So moving along, again, in this example, that's the 240 plus 0 plus 1 plus 24 plus 3 plus 114. Those are just the numbers this agency is achieving for each of those 6 areas of AB 104. So that's getting us about, looks like about 370 some overall. So we're looking at the total number of outcomes we achieve and dividing it by that 1408 that qualify for those outcomes at all, and that gets us about 27%. So I'll just say those first two examples, just for what it's worth, this agency is about average, and this last one, they're definitely below average. I'll just say if you're a really, really, really good agency or a really, really good consortium, it's possible to get over 100% in this area. Obviously, in this example, we're way short of this. Because we're looking at the number of students that actually stick around long enough, not the other of instances. If we use the duplicated number, then we're going to have a lower percent, so then we're going to, not really be measuring it exactly right. We're looking at the students, not program instances in this case. So really just to be fair to you, the agency, you might say, but that would be the snarky answer. The better answer is the one I gave you in all sincerity. Okay, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, count them, 4 different ways of measuring performance and persistence. We have the how many get to 1 hour. Of those that get to 1 hour, how many get to 12 hours? Of those that get to 12 hours, how many get an outcome? And then doubling back, of those that get to 12 hours, how many get a valid pre-post pair? Those are the 12 different ways we can look at performance and persistence. So at the end of the day, when we look at this, obviously we then determine, do we have good performance or bad performance? We can do that measuring up against state goals, state averages. We can look at the CASAS data portal. We can compare against our own agency's level of performance in past years. Lots of ways of deciding what's good and what's bad, but you've got 4 different metrics, so lots of resources I just put on your lap of ways to do that. So with all those different methods and resources, you can, at the end of the day, determine, is performance high or low? Is persistence high or low? So obviously, if you're determining is performance high or low, and is your persistence high or low, we're basically giving you a simple grid here where obviously that gives you 4 different possibilities in which your data can fall, where you can be good in both, that's in the black, you can be struggling in both, that's in the red, or you can have some strange combination of being high in one and lower the other. Those are the upper left and lower right that you see in brown. So just because it's been a while, I'm going to pause because I'm going to start getting into the laundry list now. Does everybody follow me how you can use those reports, use the metric or metrics of your choosing, and overall figure out, is performance good or bad, and at the same time figure out, is persistence good or bad? You might get the same answer for both. You might get different answers for both, but at the end of the day, that means your overall level of performance is going to fit into one of 4 different possibilities as represented by this simple chart: persistence high, low, performance high or low. Everybody with me here on that basic concept of reviewing your data? Okay, everybody's saying yes. I've got to say fewer answers on this one, but at least everybody that's answering is yes. So I'm overgeneralizing, but I guess I'm just going to assume that we're all good to go here with that, because I'm not hearing anybody say no. I'm not hearing anybody call me on any of this, so I assume we're fine. Okay, let's go ahead and move along then. Okay, so let's look at these. So first off, if you're great in both, well, again, that would be on the data portal. For persistence, that's easy. That 70% averages out, and across all levels, we tend to be the same. For performance, that really depends on whether it's high-level ESL, low-level ESL, ASE, or low-level ABE, but more on that at the end when we get into the data portal. That you're to find out good or bad performance, you need to do a little bit more research based on that based on, all the different levels and that data that we have on the data portal. You can find that on the CASAS data portal. We'll look at that at the end, but the short answer is look at the CASAS data portal and you can get all of our goals and all of our averages, dating all the way back to about program year 04-05. You can look at your own agency. You can look at, different sized agencies. You can look at regions. You can look state level. You can, of course, look at your own agency if you prefer to just hone in on Placer or just hone in on Corona or whatever. You can do that from the state perspective, regional perspective, or individual agency perspective. I think I'm sticking with the short answer, and we can get into some of those details here at the end when we actually look at the data portal as a resource. But the short answer is you can find all that in the data portal. The persistence answer, I can give you a nice cookie cutter answer that's true for pretty much everything. On performance, I can't. It really kind of depends on whether you're AB, EASC, or ESL, I've got to say. But anyway, you can look at performance high or low or persistence high or low. If you're doing great in both, congratulations. Maybe you don't need to do anything, but you're in a unique little club perhaps. Okay, then the next one is if your performance is high and your persistence is low. I'll just say first off, that's very, very, very unusual. Really hard to be great in performance and yet still having persistence be not so good. So I'll just say you've really bucked the odds by being in this part of the grid, but it's mathematically possible, but very, very unusual. But we'll just say either way, given how unusual it is, gotta say if you find out that you're in that part of the grid, chances are there's something quirky or something erroneous in how you figured out your performance or persistence most likely. So we'll just say very unusual. If you somehow end up there, then just hard to figure out how you managed to buck the odds and get in that area. But we'll just say then look at improving your pre and post testing rates for students. Then moving along the grid here, if you're low in both, that's where we're focusing a lot here, where, hey, you figure out, hey, you need to bone up on performance a little bit, and you also need to bone up on persistence. Then we're saying, yeah, that's when you need to look at basic cleanup. That is, if persistence is not so hot, if data cleanup is not so hot, well, you need to look at data cleanup first. Focus on demographics, program and class enrollment, 12 hours, and so on. That is, you need to address those usual suspects. Really focus on that first. If you haven't addressed the usual suspects, then no matter how well you test, it's not going to matter. If you haven't addressed usual suspects, then no matter how well your students perform on the test results or get AEP outcomes, no matter. So if that's the issue, work on those basic issues first. If you found that some of the getting to 1 hour is okay, but the issue is more with getting that qualifying pre-test, then you might need to just get everybody pre and post tested. In some cases you might be okay with hours and demographics, but not so much with testing. So if the specific persistence issue is with the left-hand side of the AEP summary or the NRS specific way, then you really need to look at just getting all your students tested. You're not really ready to look at what you need to do to improve student test performance, but you do want to really do that full court press to get a pre and a post for all your students. Obviously, until you pre-post all students, you've got a 0% chance of really, doing well in terms of getting good gains on your pre and post test results. Then finally, last but not least, in the upper left, you could potentially have performance low, but still be looking okay or better for persistence. So if that's the case, if persistence is high, well, then that suggests that you're doing fine with those 12-hour, 1-hour paradigms. You're doing fine with getting all your students pre and post tested. But if your performance is still low, well, then that means you're doing great with data cleanup and fine with getting everybody pre and post tested. But if your performance is still low, then that suggests there's an issue with what's going on in the classroom. If your persistence is high, that means you're doing fine with basic data issues and pre and post testing, but you're not necessarily doing well with pre-post results. If you're fine in one and not the other, then that suggests you need to look at the classroom. So with that, I'll just say that means you need to, look at, teacher observations, maybe look at lesson planning issues, whatever it is, but then you need to look at the actual performance, not just getting the individuals tested. Okay, so that was a huge mouthful, skating around all 4 levels. Is everybody still with me on that basic description on some of the basic ways in which you can diagnose your overall agency issues based just on those simple issues with persistence and performance? And again, that mode of analysis is oversimplified, but if you're looking for an easy first step where you have something instead of nothing, you can just look at these basic reports and get a pretty strong conclusion, without having to dig all that deep. You can look at those basic reports with the idea being you can just get that general idea, persistence high-low, performance high-low, and at least make that initial decision on what track you need to take at the agency program, or in some cases overall consortium level, to kind of organize your data, organize your staff level and student level efforts to make sure you've got the right idea before you move forward with any agency or consortium-wide planning ideas or whatever. Getting that basic idea first is a real good way to then proceed forward with a data cleanup plan and or a pre and post testing plan and or an instructional performance plan. Okay, so moving along, what if your persistence rates are at or below the state averages? Well, that simply suggests there's a big issue with your pre and post testing, of all your students. Again, that means you need to look at get everybody tested. Until you get everybody, or you get a good percentage of your students tested, obviously you're not going to have a good way to really know whether your student assessment performance is good or bad. You need to get the bulk of your students tested first. So yes, we'll get into that here. Again, you probably think I'll never get there, but I'll be getting there here in just a minute, I promise. So again, you need to get the students tested. Okay, here again, you can look at the agency or student levels. Okay, that one I didn't mean to throw in there. That was a slide I should have subtracted. Sorry, I didn't get that one out. But anyway, you'll get it when you look at your notes, obviously. So you can look at the student and agency levels here, where, if you're looking at improving it, persistence, you've got the agency and student level strategies. So here's some student level strategies where obviously for pre-post testing, you need to track attendance. The obvious way that you fail to get that pre-post pair are for students that maybe, fly the coop on you, so you need to be really rigorous with that student's attendance. We're suggesting 3 or more days. So once they have 3 or more days of absence, you immediately need to follow up with that student. To avoid that from happening, you need to tell students upon entry that they need to notify that teacher once they're leaving the class. And then that middle one is kind of the overlying truth, you might say, where when you're looking at tracking students' attendance, in order to make sure you get pre-post pairs on everybody, it's totally unfair to the teacher, but nonetheless, that's just a hard reality that it's totally unfair to the teacher. That clear line of communication between teachers and students kind of means anything and everything, where it is typically on the teacher, maybe not 100% of the time, but in general, if you're the administrator, the student may or may not know you. If you're the data manager, the student may or may not know you. The person the student really knows well and actually listens to is that teacher. So for that reason, it really falls on the teacher to make sure that that student is not going to fly the coop on you. Then also, again, tracking attendance, make sure you've got a flexible schedule, make sure you accommodate students to get those 12 hours, to get those outcomes, to get that pre-post pair. If they look like they're not enrolling or they drop out early, look at that overall school schedule, figure out alternatives for ways to try to get the student in the door. Also invest in alternative distance learning, independent study. Lots of you are looking at alternative file formats as a good way of maybe accommodating students better so they can stick around long enough to get pre-post, stick around long enough to get AEP outcomes, and so on. Okay, to get more, another student level set of tips, is the reward system. Lots of agencies have told me over the years, you have little reward system. What I'll just say is sometimes it's just a little piece of paper that the secretary prints from her computer. That's all it seems to take sometimes to motivate students. Sometimes it's a t-shirt, pencil, paper set. Sometimes it's no tangible reward whatsoever other than just praise. But bottom line is I've seen agencies come up with very low level reward incentive programs, and it can be really low level, really, really cheap, and it still seems to serve as a very effective way to motivate students. So I'll just say somehow, some way, establish rewards and better acknowledgement for your student when they complete that pre-post test pair. No matter how low you go, it doesn't seem to matter. You can go as low as you need to, and it still seems to motivate students. Another issue is relieve test anxiety. Look at practice test items, extra communication to students to make sure they realize it's no big deal taking the test. And then, of course, you've got the TE reports, student gains, learning gains, and so on. Make sure you review those reports regularly so you have a really good idea at the agency level on which students have completed that pre-post pair and which haven't. And then again, once you take that separate step, you may need to align assessment with instruction. At the agency level, very similar. You're looking at that clear line of communication. The communication between teacher and student is important at the student level. Communication between teacher and administration is very important at the agency level. Again, you want to have consistent team meetings where you're looking at, your class schedule, which classes and programs to prioritize, how you want to schedule that, which assessments to administer, and how you fit in testing with all the classes you do schedule. Be very case specific about testing dates at the class and individual level, and then be very case specific about assigning responsibilities. The more specific and more accountable you are at the staff level, you might say the whole name of the game here is to be accountable for students. Obviously, if you're super accountable for students and using all these, detail-oriented AEP reports and TE, but then you completely go loosey-goosey on staff accountability where you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot right off the bat, just like you're already necessarily doing with all the state and federal reporting data, for accountability. Be equally detail-oriented when it comes to staff accountability. Identify specific staff, to be responsible for testing. Designate your data staff, designate your teachers, make sure you're specific with who has to set the scheduling, etc., but be as specific as possible on who does what, when, and which person is responsible for doing it every step of the way. Okay, then also agency level, schedule your testing dates. The more specific you are with dates, set a calendar at the beginning of the year, set contingencies for students that leave early, set contingencies for students that are absent and need a makeup day. At the front end, communicate about testing dates and why it's so important to get all those students tested. Okay, and then here's the biggie. All of these things I've said so far about preparing students and agencies for pre and post testing, I genuinely say overall, more agencies are doing a good job than a bad job. This is one where I'd say overall more agencies are doing a poor job than a good job. is putting it in writing that all those things are great, but to really ensure that at the agency level you're going to follow through on this, you want to put all these things in writing and document it in your state and local assessment policy. Specify how you're addressing those state level responsibilities as stipulated in the state level assessment policy, and then really stipulate which staff are responsible for what at the agency level. So that includes having a very specific procedure for placement with that appraisal or locator, a very specific process for doing pre and post testing. Again, times and dates for testing, being very specific about who's responsible. If you're e-testing, list by name those test proctors and test coordinators. If you're pencil paper testing, you may not have formal proctors or coordinators, but put in writing who's responsible for doing those same duties for pencil paper testing. Stipulate who's responsible for maintaining all those pencil paper booklets and lock storage. Stipulate who's responsible for all those issues related to test security, etc., etc. Again, if you just generically assign it, you're probably not going to do that well. You need to be very specific about which staff are responsible for each individual duty. And then specify policies for those quote-unquote hard-to-read students. So that's a broad category, but students with disabilities, make sure you have in writing how you're covering them. Specific programs like high school recovery and distance learning, specify in writing how you're addressing those students that may be more difficult to get tested than others. Okay, and then finally, use those reports. Look at specific students. So what you're going to find is, you're going to be good in some areas, but not others. So this gets to your question a little bit, Molly, and a little bit, Jody, where you're looking for more specifics. Where at the end of the day, you probably will need to look at Table 4, look at specific levels. If you're using the AEP reports, you can't get it to the level, to individual levels, but you will probably find different results for ABE than you do for ESL, or from ESL than you do for high school diploma, etc., where you're going to get certain areas of strength and certain areas of need. So you're going to want to dig down and figure out those areas of need. That's going to be a good clue for figuring out what specific steps you might be taking successfully versus which ones you're not. And then again, look at the testing itself. Are you using the right test modality? Are you making sure you're getting appropriate post-test, pre-post-test pairs from a CASAS A, B, C, D level point of view? Are you using approved tests? Et cetera, et cetera. All those things you already know related to the specifics on CASAS testing. And then again, using the Persister, you also will want to use those different metrics I outlined. Again, you may find that certain areas you're doing really, really well, so you may not need to do this targeted effort or surgical strike, as I like to say, but just about all of you are guaranteed to have a few levels where you're underperforming that might represent your soft spot at the agency or consortium level. So use these reports to kind of figure out which areas are the ones where you need to provide this quote-unquote surgical strike. Okay, so we're getting here to the next level here. So I've been talking a mile a minute. We're actually fine on time, believe it or not. But are we doing all right? I kind of whisked through that laundry list quickly. So way overdue for a sanity check now. Are we following this, yes or no? Okay, everybody that's answering is saying yes. We're suspiciously void of questions. So I'm just going to have to live in my J make-believe world that everything's so clear nobody has questions. I know I'm in fantasy land, but hey, that's where I'm going to stay residing for now. Okay, so anyway, so we've got the other side of learner performance here where, hey, sometimes our Sometimes our persistence is actually pretty good, but our performance is actually low. So that is, we do well in terms of result. We do all right in terms of getting everybody tested, but somehow we still don't seem to do that well from a performance point of view. So we'll take that to the next level. So again, if our persistence looks average or better, but our performance remains low, well, then that suggests that whole getting our basic data in the system is fine. Getting everybody pre and post tested is also basically fine, but we're still looking at low performance. So at the end of the day, that suggests that there's something to do with the way our students are actually performing on the tests. So that's things we can follow up on and use these same reports to garner results, but it's a different series of recommendations, you might say. So again, just like we had for low performance, low persistence, if it's low performance, high persistence, here's yet another set of suggestions, that you might want to consider. So we'll start with a bunch of student level suggestions. Again, we're not looking at getting our students tested anymore. We covered that in the last round of suggestions. Now we're looking at student focused strategies for improving performance. So one thing we're bringing up is goals. A lot of you have heard me talk about how it's not required, and that's just simply because goals are not required. That is, goals are not required for anything related to state and federal reporting, but whether you're doing it formally or informally, we would definitely say looking at goals at some level is a good thing to do. Here's why, is it's not really that important for you to report goals to the feds or the state, but it is a good idea for you to do that informally so you can compare that to performance. A lot of times that performance falls off the map if you're not mindful of what the students actually want to learn and follow through with instruction that represents, what the students actually want to learn. Align instructional materials, make sure what you're teaching in class, covers what they need to learn and so on. Compare that placement level, so that's getting into the details of the testing. Make sure that your e-test locator, your pencil paper appraisal is getting students in the right level. Make sure you're using that process to get everybody in the correct level in the first place. Long story short is, a lot of times when your things like persistence are good and you're getting everybody tested, but the results are still less than 100%, a real common explanation for why that might happen is you're either not doing the appraisal or locator correctly, or you're skipping that step altogether. That's a really, 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 really good way to make sure your performance will remain exceedingly low. And then again, kind of related to the goals, make sure that what learners are expecting or what they're actually getting. Student level recognition is big here too. Give the students lots of recognition for sticking around long enough to pre-post. Obviously, at the same time, give them even greater recognition if they do a bang-up job and make a great gain. Always good to review test-taking skills. Some people think that's a no-no from a CASAS point of view, but it's totally fine. We definitely recommend it. We also suggest individualized instruction as much as possible. No such thing as too much review. And then, whether it's at the student level or class level or both, evaluate performance by student or by class and identify the best practices of top performers. So for this bullet, look at how different students are performing. Identify what your top students are doing, share those practices with your other students that maybe aren't doing quite as well. Okay, at the agency level, again, review agency-wide performance and compare by class level of program. So here's where those TE instructional reports come in. Run those competency reports, run the content standard reports, individual skills profile, and so on. Make sure your teachers receive them promptly. A big issue is with hours. Make sure you get those 70 hours of instruction between pre-test and post-test. Get that feedback from teachers and students. Make sure the testing fits what they're doing. Make sure you're getting the hours and so on. And then again, just like you need to evaluate performance, identify your top students, share the practices of your best students with your lower performance students to make sure everybody's aware. Similarly, look at performance by class. Share the performance of your top performing classes with the other teachers whose classes are not doing as well. Make sure they replicate in the lower performing classes what they're doing in the top performing classes. Again, you can simply review which classes are you getting lots of gains, identify those as the top performers, look at other classes where your gains aren't so good, make sure the lower performing classes are doing as well as your top performing classes by sharing. Okay, and then make sure your performance is in sync with local and state priorities. So make sure that the students you're serving at your agency, looking at socioeconomic levels in your local region, particular groups of students, whether it's ethnicity, nationality, instructional level, etc. Look at look at demographics and so on in your local area. Identify, look at whether it's older students or younger students. Again, income level. Look at all of those employment characteristics and demographics characteristics of students in your region. Make sure you understand who those students are. And then in terms of things like classroom placement and pre-post assessment, make sure all of those practices that you're doing at your agency are in sync with the sort of students you're serving in your local region. One way you can do that is by looking at those barriers to employment. Make sure the testing you're doing matches, what kind of barriers your students may or may not have. Again, compare that with things like, demographics characteristics, labor force status, and so on. Make sure all those characteristics are in line. You can also look at some of those services you're providing, in particular, some of those things like, legal counseling, fiscal counseling, transportation services, childcare, and so on. Those kind of short-term services, good way to identify what specific needs your students might or might not have. Compare that with your assessment performance. There might be a disconnect there. That's another way to get the testing in alignment with what your students may or may not be doing. Attendance fits in quite a bit with results, just like it does with getting everybody tested. So if your attendance hours looks weak, if your hours between tests looks weak, verify your attendance hours, verify what you're doing in that local assessment policy to make sure you're doing that. And then define and implement NRS local performance goals. That's a concept we've been talking about in NRS WIOA 2 land for a long time, but you can use some of the same metrics we went over in the first half of this presentation to identify areas of strength at the agency and consortium level, identify areas of need at the agency and consortium level, identify those gaps and use that to implement local performance goals. Hey, in low-level ABE and all areas of ESL, we're looking great, but once you get into high-level ABE, HSE, high school diploma, that's where we're weak. So we're going to assign our goals in those high-level ABE and ASE levels because, hey, based on all this data we're reviewing, that's clearly the area where our agency and our consortium is performing the lowest. I just made that example up, but again, you can look at it by level, by program, by a combination of the two to identify specific areas of strength and need. That's what they're talking about with NRS local performance goals. Okay, so I'm going to pause. So another thing you can do, I'm going to pause here for a minute. Any questions? I'm realizing once again, talking a mile a minute here. Any questions at all? Okay, taking your word for it. Thank you. Okay, so another way you can look at this is looking at your AEP data integrity. I brought this up a good bit in the quote-unquote quantitative sessions as well, that there's the what I call the back end of the DIR, items 23 to 27 if you prefer. These are the AEP specific areas of the DIR. Again, you've got 23 to 27. You've got 23A through 27A. You can compare that to items 23B through 27B. Bottom line is 23A through 27A lists your qualified AEP outcomes. That is, it's giving you those item counts of students that, had all of the basic demographics, program enrollment, fully qualified for AEP reporting, and basically earn the outcome. Then on 23B through 27B, you have outcomes that were marked. That is, it was bubbled on the scan form or imported from your attendance system or whatever, but for whatever reason they did not qualify, so the bubble was bubbled, the checkbox was checked, but because of some drop reason, maybe missing demographics, missing program enrollment, 12 hours, whatever, it did not qualify. So if you look at the 23A to 27A, that gives you the number who actually earned AEP outcomes. 23B through 27B shows that they were marked but didn't actually earn the outcome. So bottom line is, if you've got a big number on the A and the small number on the B, that's good news. You want there to be a big difference or big gap between those numbers, because if they're showing a lot on A but not B, that means just about everybody that you're marking to get the outcome officially did earn it. If you've got equal or higher numbers on B than you do on A, then that's bad news, because you're basically showing you're marking a lot of outcomes, but a lot of them are not officially earning that official AEP outcome because they're getting dropped for whatever reason. So again, this would be more your AEP-centric way of maybe measuring that if you don't really want to get too much into pre-post testing. If the numbers are the same, again, bad news because you're losing a lot of them. If they're different, then that's probably good news. Again, you're looking for a high number on the A's and a low number on the B's. Again, that's another way, more AEP-specific way of measuring the same information. Sorry, but I'm going to right away just make sure, does that make sense? Of all the explanations I've given over the last hour and change, that's the one that I would say is the most marginal yet. I'm not sure I'm, talking anything other than authentic frontier gibberish right now. Everybody's insisting that it's making perfect sense. Wonderful. All right. Okay, what if everything needs to, there you go, there you go. So thank you for the summary. Anyway, so what if we're a basket case and we need to improve both? Obviously, no, that doesn't mean basket case, but hey, we've got problems in both areas. Then we're just saying all of these things we're talking about you really ought to do. But what we're saying is, yeah, then you might want to just look at resources overall. You might want to hit the drawing board and look at resources, kind of look at getting a little better, and then look at this analysis again. But obviously, there's lots of great resources on the TAP website, resources for students, resources for administrators, teachers, data managers, all kinds of great stuff. Student success stories shows you some good examples that you might be able to replicate. Student supports, lots of information there. Practices with promise, so obviously look through that website. Lots of great suggestions on what the quote-unquote high-performing agencies and high-performing consortia are doing. Lots of great info there. Okay, then obviously lots of great info on the CASAS website as well. You can look at things like Quick Search, EL Civics. There's some information on Common Core standards. We have all of those instructional reports. If you attended our webinar on the 19th of February, we did one called CASAS Assessment to Instruction. That's basically what that fourth bullet means, where you're using those test results in TE to use your test results to inform instruction. Two major ways to do that. One is through the competency reports, where you're measuring all of those test items to the life skills competencies. You can also do that looking at content standard results, where you're measuring all those test results against academic related content standards. Okay, so CAEP website, here it is. Again, resources for everybody involved. I'll let Liberty or Veronica maybe in the chat chime in anything extra if there are any details there that I'm missing that need to be added. But I'll just generally say, of course, there's lots of great information there. CASAS Quick Search, so that's what you can, this is a free resource on our CASAS website. How many of you have actually used CASAS Quick Search before? Okay, a few yeses. Oh, more yeses than usual. So it looks like about 50-50. Not perfect, but yeah, this is a much better ratio than a typical crowd. But anyway, the quick search is what you can use if you find that you need materials. So the cookie cutter example would be using those TE reports. So you're looking at content standard reports and or you're looking at CASAS competency reports. You know there's a couple areas of weakness. So you've identified the competencies and or content standards that represent those areas of weakness. So if you find those areas, then you know you need to improve instruction in those areas. If you know you need to improve instruction in those areas, then there's a really good chance, then you can go ahead and follow up on quick search to kind of look up instructional materials. So you can search by competency. You can also search by content standard. So I'm just making it up. I can't remember if there's an example here. Okay, no, there's not. I kind of consolidated. But you can see you can search by competencies and content standard. So I'm just going to make it up because I remember it off the top of my head. Let's say you ran the competency reports. And again, at the end of the day, you've run the reports. You've determined that CASAS competency 4.1.2 is a big need area at your agency. As an aside, 4.1.2 is the competency that addresses job applications and resumes. So I'm just making it up, just saying, we'll just say that you figured out that job applications and resumes is a weak spot at your agency. So knowing that that's a weak spot, you can then go to quick search and type in competency 4.1.2. You can basically, go into competencies and content standards and input that competency number, click search, and once you do that, quick search will spit out a big long laundry list of approved materials that address competency 4.1.2 specifically. So if you know that's a big need area, it will give you that list of instructional materials you could consider to improve your student performance on that specific competency or specific content standard. What I'll just say is we didn't make this up. We don't really have materials at CASAS that address this. Again, we're a small agency. We're not big enough to have a big instructional textbook department where we're making our textbooks like the big guys do. We don't do that at all, but we do have the next best thing, which is CASAS Quick Search, where we at least have a part-time staff that reviews materials from other larger organizations that have a publishing department. We only list those publishers and materials that meet the clean bill of health from that person that reviews the materials. We have somebody review it and give the thumbs up before we ever even think about putting anything in quick search. Again, there's 2,300 some odd materials in quick search presently. Okay, so moving along here. Another thing is we have EL Civics. Again, this has gotten bigger as time progresses. Lots of great information here on the EL Civics website. So again, lots of information you can get there. where lots of good materials for which to follow up, especially on the ESL side. If you need more materials, another place you might want to consider reviewing is on that EL Civics website. Again, we've got close to 60 civic objective areas covering everything under the sun in terms of instructional topics, there on our EL Civics website. Okay, moving along. This is something that I don't think that many people know about, but in particular, if you're looking at the content standard reports, you can align the strengths and needs related to CASAS content standards to Common Core. There's a special crosswalk you can get to that basically aligns CASAS content standards to Common Core standards. I would say they're like us rather than we're like them. That's our myopic way of presenting it, because the bottom line is our content standards actually existed several years before CCR, CCSS, but at the end of the day, once they came up with the Common Core standards, bottom line is they looked and felt a lot like what we already developed for CASAS content standards, not word by word the same, but the same basic taxonomy system and definitely the same academic areas, that is the quote-unquote academic skills that Common Core addresses, pretty much the exact same skills addressed by CASAS content standards. So if you want to be able to show what's going on in terms of Common Core, once you look at CASAS content standards, you can use that crosswalk and get lots of commonality. So just another good way to align it if you need a good way to foster something that will be clear to everybody involved. Okay, then looking at agency level performance, more on the data portal in a minute. Another good resource is that American Community Survey. That's one that I know the Chancellor's Office and CDE have been using a lot to allow, basically that's what you want to use to make sure what you're doing at your agency and your consortium aligns with what your overall community is doing. You can look at promising practices. I'll just say we have promising practices on our CASAS website. That's a program that we used for WIOA 2 in the good old days, where we would award specific agencies a promising practice award. Unfortunately, a few years ago, CDE got rid of that, but we still do have all those agencies that won promising practices over those 10 or 12 years in which it was offered. I'll just say to that point, AEP has developed what it's called practices of promise. Sure sounds a lot like promising practices to me, but to their credit, they've looked at that. They've realized it has been discontinued. They've realized that discontinuing it was quite unfortunate, so they're trying to resurrect it for AEP purposes. So you can find that practices of promises on the AEP website. And then again, you can use TE data management reports. So for testing specific test results specifically, we're suggesting those competency reports and CASAS content standard reports. For just overall agency level performance, you might back up a step, look at enrollment, look at demographics, look at outcomes, and then of course you can use those general data management reports like NRS and data integrity. Moving along, we've got the data portal. So again, this allows you to compare performance results as well as persistence results. Sorry, I'm moving. Okay, I do have a link here. So again, here's a screenshot where you can look at performance data based on NRS Table 4. You can also look at Table 4B. You can also look at the persistence report, but you can search by agency, by regency. You can look at statewide. You can look at agency size. You can go by region. There's like 5 or 6 different ways of evaluating. The most common, obviously, is by agency, but it basically gives you every year of NRS performance data dating back every year to 0405, so you can compare and contrast. You can compare, LAUSD to LACCD, or you compare San Francisco to Oakland, or Riverside to San Bernardino, or Fresno to Bakersfield. That is all of those illustrious California regional rivalries. You can easily compare that. At the using the data portal. But bottom line is more important than the goofy examples I'm giving you is this is where you can find things like statewide average, for performance, statewide average for persistence. If you want to look across program year, you can look at the goal and performance of this current year. You can also look at the overall statewide level of performance from previous years if you feel like looking back a ways is going to be as or more helpful than looking solely at this year. Okay, that's the next slide. That's why I was kind of playing musical slides earlier, but here it is. It's giving you go to that California Accountability website and simply click Data Portal. I can't remember if there's another slide. Okay, that's it. But once you click Data Portal, that will actually go to there's a link that you click and have no choice, and it'll basically give you three options. One option is it will just give you the aggregate NRS tables, which is great information, but not exactly what I'm talking about here. But it will give you one link to go for performance, another link to go for persistence. So again, you'll go back to this generic looking screenshot where you can then look at either, you can look at either persistence or performance, and then again, search by agency, statewide, by region, whatever. Refine your search by looking at which specific agency or which specific region or whatever, and then refining it even more by looking at a particular year. So again, you can play around with it. Feel free to email me if you have more specific questions on that. But again, if you go to that link, you can look at that data portal. You can really find everything you ever wanted to know and more, related to current or longitudinal data using that feature. I'll just say as an aside, we've been promoting that a lot more. I'm sure a lot of people are looking at this because you're interested in that 3-year planning that's due in May. Obviously, from our perspective, really, 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 really good idea to look at that CASAS data portal. We know there's no other resource you're going to find anywhere that comes even close to providing as comprehensive a data resource as we have. There's other things that get at it, but it's not nearly as accurate. It doesn't go anywhere near as long. You might be able to look at last year and look at last year on an incomplete basis. Here you can look at complete data for some 13, 14 consecutive years. Way more comprehensive, way more complete than any other resource you're ever going to find. Sorry, it's not even, I'm sounding like a propaganda machine, but in this case, there's not even an argument. It's not even close. The data portal is by far the one and only complete resource for data analysis. Okay, there's enough, syrup and propaganda for one fell swoop for you there. And that said, that's it. We've got 4 minutes left if you're interested in any questions. I'm finishing just a smidge early. I'll look for questions. If there aren't any, I guess Liberty or Veronica can take over.
All right. Well, thank you, Jay, and I want to thank everyone else for participating today. Our next webinar is on using Google for innovative collaboration tips and ideas for consortia. This webinar is on April 23rd at 12 o'clock, and a link to register is in the chat box. It is floating up pretty quickly, but I'm sure you all are familiar with that link. And just as a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be available online on our website. And after the webinar ends today, an evaluation link will open on the screen, and we really want to encourage you to complete that evaluation as it supports our efforts of continuous improvement. I also want to remind you that if there is a need for technical assistance or professional development, please contact TAP. A link to submit a support request is also in the chat box. And thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.